Welcome to Swai Files. I am Swai. That night, my grandfather sat by the fire, his eyes shimmering not with joy, but with the overwhelming fear he carried. He whispered the most haunting story of his life, an encounter with a creature he could never explain, even to this day. It wasn't just a wild animal, it was something more, something you never want to face. In 1957, deep in the Vietnamese jungle, where the sound of insects echoed from all directions, he and his comrades began their patrol as usual. But this time was different. They found a severely injured ARVN soldier lying at the base of a tree, trembling, barely able to mutter a few vague words. "It's still nearby. Stay away." They thought he was just in shock from the battle, unaware that his warning was all too real. A few hours later, as darkness enveloped the forest, an eerie silence fell. Then a scream pierced the air, freezing them all in their tracks. The team rushed toward the sound, gripping their guns tightly, hearts pounding. In a clearing deep in the jungle, they confronted an indescribable horror. Beneath the dim canopy stood a creature, nearly 2.5 meters tall, covered in fur. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and its hairy hands clutched human bones. In a split second, one soldier fired, but it was a terrible mistake. The creature didn't stay still. It charged with unimaginable speed, throwing the soldier aside, his agonized scream echoing through the silent forest. In panic, the team unloaded their guns on the creature, but to no avail. It hesitated only for a moment before vanishing into the darkness, leaving behind gasps and terrified eyes. The soldier was gravely injured, but this wasn't the end. As they tried to return to base, the creature reappeared, dragging another soldier into the forest before anyone could react. Though trembling, my grandfather recounted that he tried to remain calm, but eventually collapsed and lost consciousness. When he awoke, he found himself alone in the jungle, surrounded by the bodies of his comrades. Heavy footsteps and horrifying breathing still lingered nearby. He had to play dead to survive until the creature finally left. That night changed him forever. What was that creature? Only one word escaped his lips after telling the story: Bigfoot. From that moment, I understood that the deep forests weren't just home to wildlife, but also to secrets that should never be uncovered. As my grandfather reached the end of his story, I felt the atmosphere grow heavy, as if his past fears filled the room. But the story didn't end there. He paused for a moment, his eyes lost in memories he had never wanted to recall. After the creature disappeared, he stood up, his body shaking and weak. Blood oozed from a wound on his head, his vision blurred, but fear pushed him forward. He groped his way through the forest all night, trying to find his way back to the base. No comrades, no gunfire, just him and the terror that the creature could return at any moment. He trudged on, his feet crunching on dry leaves, the small sound feeble against the eerie silence of the nighttime jungle. Occasionally, he would hear faint noises, heavy footsteps or deep breaths echoing from somewhere in the darkness, making every cell in his body tremble. At dawn, he stumbled upon an old helmet lying on the ground, with a bullet hole right in the center. It belonged to his comrade, the first to be attacked by the creature. Nearby, the remains of his body were scattered, torn apart savagely. My grandfather had to summon all his courage to not collapse, knowing that if he did, he would never make it back to the base. He said that by some miracle, he found the map the team had dropped. With a sliver of hope, he followed its directions, climbing over hills and through thick bushes. Eventually, when he was on the verge of exhaustion, he saw the faint lights of the base in the distance. But when he returned, he was no longer the brave soldier he once was. His body was covered in injuries, but it was his mind that had been wounded most deeply. He couldn't forget the glowing eyes in the night and the creature's threatening growl. After returning home, many nights he stayed awake, unable to sleep, haunted by the thought that the creature was still lurking somewhere, waiting for a chance to strike again. What he had experienced wasn't just a hallucination or a nightmare. Perhaps, deep within the dense jungles of Vietnam, the creature people called Bigfoot still existed, hiding in the shadows, waiting to emerge when no one expected it. His story became deeply ingrained in my mind. But what chilled me the most was how he ended it. "You know," he whispered, "I've never told anyone this, but I'm certain it didn't go anywhere. It's still here, and maybe it's still watching." The room fell into an eerie silence. I couldn't tear my gaze away from his eyes filled with the darkness of untold horrors. And that was the moment I realized. Stories of Bigfoot aren't just myths. They're terrifying fragments lurking in the shadows of the forests, where human existence feels more fragile than ever. After my grandfather returned to the base, the other soldiers couldn't believe his story. They thought the fear of war had clouded his mind, turning ordinary things into nightmares. But he didn't care. He knew what he had seen and felt. The creature wasn't a hallucination. It was real, and its presence haunted him for years after. On the nights following his return, every time he closed his eyes, the memories of the encounter would come flooding back. The inhuman scream echoed in his mind, the image of the towering creature with glowing eyes piercing through the darkness like headlights shining directly at him. He tried to move on, to believe it was a one-time event, but fate wouldn't let him. A few weeks after his return, on a moonless night, he woke up in his simple tent at the base. The night was unusually quiet, with no sounds of insects or wind rustling through the trees. He realized something was wrong. The same sense of unease filled his chest, just like before his team had encountered the creature in the forest. When he stepped outside, what he saw made his feet freeze. Massive, deep footprints clearly visible in the soft earth right outside his tent. The footprints were so large, with distinct toes, that they couldn't be mistaken for any animal he had ever seen. They led straight from the edge of the forest into the center of the base, then disappeared as if the creature had vanished into thin air. That night, my grandfather said, the entire base was disturbed by strange noises. Deep, guttural roars echoed from a distance, but enough to send chills down anyone's spine. A few guards reported seeing a huge shadow moving swiftly between the trees, but no one dared to get close. They just stood there, trembling, gripping their guns, waiting for something terrible to happen. My grandfather believed the creature had been following him since their first encounter. It had come back, not to kill him right away, but as if to toy with him, silently watching his every move. Other soldiers started to feel anxious, although no one wanted to believe the eerie tales of a strange creature. The constant strange signs made it impossible to ignore. One early morning, when my grandfather and a small group of soldiers left the base for patrol, they found similar footprints stretching along the path they were about to take. The footprints were deeply embedded in the ground, terrifyingly large, and vanished mysteriously at the forest's edge. The soldiers in the group began to panic, whispering about the monster in the forest, their eyes darting nervously as if the creature was lurking nearby. But the creature wasn't just a shadow. As the group ventured deeper into the jungle, they heard noises, the sound of dry leaves being crushed underfoot, heavy breaths unlike any animal they had ever known. Everyone stopped, listening. No one dared to speak, but fear was thick in the air. The sounds grew closer. My grandfather said his heart raced as his eyes fixed on the darkness between the trees. Then, suddenly, a massive shadow darted through the trees so quickly that hardly anyone had time to react. The team immediately raised their guns, but the creature disappeared before anyone could pull the trigger. The tension grew day by day. The creature wasn't just present, it haunted them, as if it was playing a game. But the game didn't last long. One night, as my grandfather stood guard with a comrade, the familiar noises echoed from deep within the forest. But this time, it wasn't just the sound of dry leaves or breathing. It was a fierce roar, the sound of heavy footsteps pounding the ground, and then the creature appeared. My grandfather recounted the moment, his voice trembling with fear. The creature, over 2 meters tall, covered in thick fur, stepped out of the darkness. Its glowing red eyes stared directly at him and his comrade, full of hatred and death. His comrade screamed, his hands shaking as he pulled the trigger. But the bullet wasn't enough to stop the creature. It charged straight at him, its massive hands swinging, slamming the soldier to the ground like a rag doll. Blood spilled onto the ground, the soldier's screams echoing into the night, but my grandfather could do nothing. In that moment of panic, he could only step back, gripping his gun tightly but unable to fire. The creature turned and looked at him, as if deciding whether to continue the hunt. But then it let out a furious roar and disappeared into the darkness. When the other soldiers arrived, they found my grandfather kneeling on the ground, gripping his gun, his eyes vacant, staring into empty space. His comrade was dead, his body lying a few meters away, horribly mutilated. My grandfather would never forget that moment, the moment when he felt the undeniable presence of unexplainable terror. After that night, my grandfather was granted leave and returned home. But peace never returned to him. Though he had escaped the Vietnamese jungle, the memories of the creature never left him. Sometimes in his dreams, he would see those glowing red eyes again, hear the echoing roar, and feel its presence all around him. He said that after returning, he tried everything to forget the terrifying story. But he could never succeed. He always felt as though the creature was still watching him, waiting for another chance to return. Whenever he walked into a forest or saw dense darkness, he remembered the creature, something he believed never truly disappeared. His story was a warning that sometimes there are things in the forest that we can never fully understand. That creature wasn't just part of nature, it was a terror, lurking, ready to appear when no one expected it. He looked at me, his eyes clouded by time, but still reflecting the fear that had never faded. That creature, it's still out there somewhere. I sat still, feeling as though I was being watched by the glowing red eyes of Bigfoot from the darkness. There's nothing more terrifying than realizing that sometimes what we think of as legends may be all too real, and they're always waiting for the right moment to come back. The night fell like a thick black curtain, covering every corner of the warehouse where Jack, the security guard, began his night shift. Normally, Jack's night shifts were quiet, sometimes so monotonous that he almost forgot to stay alert. But tonight was different. An invisible tension filled the air, making even the smallest sounds seem strange and unsettling. Jack stepped out of his small office, the rusty door creaking behind him. Max, his faithful German shepherd, who had been his companion for many years, followed closely, his ears pricked up as if sensing something was wrong. A light drizzle fell, tapping rhythmically on the roof, while the lights from the parking lot cast shadows that seemed to stretch like waiting traps. Jack took a deep breath. The damp smell of the earth mixed with the cold night air made him shiver. "It's just a normal night," Jack reassured himself, but deep inside, he felt an eerie sensation he couldn't explain. Suddenly, Max stopped, his body tensed, eyes fixed on the thick forest nearby. Jack frowned, following Max's gaze. The night was dark, but something seemed off. Something was unusual. "Max, what is it?" Jack whispered, but Max only responded with a low growl, his hind legs ready for action. Then Jack noticed it. A foul stench wafted from the direction of the woods like the smell of something rotting. The odor made Jack gag. Slowly, he moved toward the forest, cautiously, with his hand gripping the flashlight and his gun resting in his holster. When Jack shone the flashlight into the darkness, he froze. Not far ahead was a deer carcass. But what shocked Jack wasn't just the carcass, it was its condition. The rear half of the deer had been torn apart, dark blood pooling on the ground, and the flesh had been ripped savagely, as if by something large and incredibly powerful. Jack glanced back at Max, but the dog had already sprung into action. Max charged toward the forest, growling fiercely, eyes fixed on the darkness. "Max! No!" Jack shouted, but it was too late. A deep growl echoed from within the trees, and Jack felt as though his chest was being squeezed. Something, a massive figure, slowly emerged from the shadows of the forest. It stood more than 2 meters tall, its hulking form covered in thick, dirty fur. Its eyes glowed brightly in the dark with a strange, otherworldly red hue. Without needing to think, Jack knew what it was. A creature from stories he had heard but never believed. Bigfoot. Max, unafraid, leaped toward the creature, sinking his teeth into its leg. But Bigfoot didn't even flinch. With a speed Jack couldn't comprehend, it grabbed Max, lifted him as though he were a mere toy, and flung him against a nearby tree. The sound of breaking bones echoed through the night. Jack stood paralyzed, his entire body frozen with terror. Before him, Max lay motionless, blood seeping from his mouth. The fierce loyalty and bravery once in Max's eyes were now gone. But the creature wasn't finished. Bigfoot slowly turned its head, locking its glowing red eyes onto Jack. Fear overwhelmed Jack, making it almost impossible to breathe. The creature advanced toward him, each step heavy and menacing. In a panic, Jack raised his gun, his hands shaking. He knew that the bullets in his handgun likely wouldn't be enough to stop such a massive creature. But at that moment, it was all he had. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the night, hitting Bigfoot square in the chest, but the creature barely reacted. It roared, a sound like thunder, and continued moving forward, its enormous hands reaching toward Jack. Jack turned and ran as fast as he could toward the building. The sound of Bigfoot's footsteps thundered behind him, each step making the ground tremble beneath his feet. Jack's heart pounded, and his breath grew heavier with every step. He knew that if he didn't move faster, the creature would catch him, just like it had caught Max. As Jack neared the door of the building, a powerful force slammed into him from behind, sending him sprawling to the ground. The cold earth beneath him seeped into his skin, but it wasn't the worst part. Jack could feel the weight of a massive hand pressing down on his back. For a brief moment, Jack thought this was the end, but miraculously, the creature stopped. It stared down at him one last time, its glowing red eyes piercing into Jack's soul, and then, suddenly, it released him and turned away, disappearing into the dark forest as if it had never been there. Jack lay on the ground, gasping for breath, his whole body trembling. He turned his head to look at Max, his loyal companion who was now gone forever. The pain of loss gripped Jack, but beneath it was something even more terrifying. The realization that Bigfoot was real. A creature he had never believed in before had now become a part of his horrifying reality. Jack was never the same after that night. Every time darkness fell, he felt as though something was watching him from the depths of the forest, its red eyes glowing and the silence unbearable. After that night, Jack was no longer himself. Every evening, when night came, the once peaceful quiet of his shifts was replaced with an all-consuming tension. The deep growls of Bigfoot echoed in his mind every night, a constant reminder of the terrifying encounter he could never forget. Jack had lost Max, his loyal friend, and with him, he lost his sense of security. Even after returning to work following a brief break, Jack couldn't shake the fear that lingered around him. Every time he went out for his night patrols, his eyes scanned the area, worried that the creature might return at any moment. But the strange signs didn't end there. One night, just weeks after the attack, Jack started hearing the sounds he had feared the most: heavy footsteps and deep breathing from the shadows of the forest behind the warehouse. At first, he tried to reassure himself. "It's probably just a bear or a deer," he told himself, still gripping his gun. But deep down, Jack knew the truth. Each time those sounds echoed, they carried a threat that words couldn't capture. One stormy night, Jack decided to check the area as usual. The heavy rain made it difficult to see, but it didn't stop the growing fear inside him. As he approached the forest, where Bigfoot had first appeared, Jack suddenly heard a familiar deep growl, this time just a few meters away. Jack's heart raced. He raised his flashlight and shone it into the darkness ahead. Through the rain, he saw them, those same glowing red eyes burning like embers in the night. Jack didn't need to think anymore. He knew the creature had returned. This wasn't a nightmare. It was his horrifying reality repeating itself. Bigfoot slowly emerged from the shadows, its massive form blocking out everything in front of Jack. It didn't charge at him like before. Instead, it walked slowly, as if calculating every move. The rain poured down on Jack, but he felt nothing, his entire body numb from terror. "Damn it!" Jack screamed, firing his gun wildly at the creature. The bullets tore through the night, but they had no effect. Bigfoot didn't stop. It stood there, letting out a roar as if warning Jack. "Don't fight back. You can't escape." In panic, Jack turned and ran. He dashed across the open ground, slipping on the wet soil with each desperate breath. He could hear Bigfoot's heavy footsteps closing in behind him. Every step shook the ground, making Jack feel like prey being hunted down in a nightmare he couldn't escape. Jack reached the warehouse door, threw it open, and slammed it shut, locking it immediately. Soaked in rain and sweat, his hands shook as he held the lock tight. But outside, Bigfoot didn't stop. The sound of heavy blows rattled the walls, each strike shaking the entire building. It wanted to break in. In that moment, Jack knew the creature wasn't just some mindless predator. It had chosen him. He was its target, not because of their first encounter, but because it wanted to punish him. The creature seemed determined to turn Jack's life into an endless chase. The pounding from outside continued. Jack sank to the floor, his head buried in his hands, his heart racing, his body crumbling under the weight of fear. The warehouse trembled with each blow. But then, suddenly, everything stopped. A deadly silence filled the air. Jack could hear nothing but his own ragged breathing. He lifted his head, listening. Nothing. The creature was gone, as if it had never been there. But Jack knew it was still out there somewhere, in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to return. After that night, Jack's life was forever changed. He began to have recurring nightmares, always seeing those glowing red eyes watching him from the shadows. The peace he once felt on his night shifts was now a distant memory. The smallest sounds, the rustling of leaves or the wind howling through the windows, made him jump. He eventually left his job as a security guard, taking an extended leave of absence. But even at home, the fear wouldn't let him go. Each night, he stared out the window, imagining the creature lurking in the darkness, waiting for the moment to appear. There were nights Jack didn't even dare turn off the lights, terrified that if he fell asleep, the creature would emerge and finish what it started. Jack's life became a nightmare he couldn't escape. No one believed his story. They said it was just a bad dream or a hallucination after a traumatic event. But Jack knew better than anyone. Bigfoot was real, and it would never stop. The majestic beauty of Mount Rainier, with its breathtaking landscapes, always attracts nature lovers and adventurers alike. But hidden beneath the thick fog and dense forests surrounding it, a terrifying mystery waits for those brave or unfortunate enough to trespass into its domain. And that night, a group of friends unknowingly stepped into the world of that very mystery. Mark, Anna, Brian, and Sarah decided to spend a weekend camping near the base of Mount Rainier. They sought a place to escape the hustle and bustle of city life and experience the tranquility of nature. But as they were about to discover, nature does not only offer peace. The cabin's owner, Old Jim, was a weathered man, his eyes always sharp and cautious. When Mark asked about nearby camping areas, Jim just stared at them before lowering his voice. "Don't wander too far into the woods. We've got stories around here about things no one wants to encounter." The group laughed it off, thinking Jim was just trying to scare them with old tales to spook visitors. Brian, always the joker, even quipped, "He's probably talking about Bigfoot. We'd better watch out. We might run into the beast." Everyone chuckled, but Jim's expression remained unchanged. "It's no joke, kids," he warned. "I've seen things in these woods. Strange noises, footprints bigger than anything I've ever seen. You'd best be careful." However, his warnings didn't faze the group. They packed their gear, set up camp, and enjoyed a fun evening filled with laughter and conversation that stretched late into the night. Darkness fell completely, and the forest around them settled into an eerie silence. The night began with the familiar sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the light breeze. But soon, a different sound emerged, something deep and low, a rumbling growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. It made the group fall silent, each one freezing in place. Anna was the first to speak, her voice filled with uncertainty. "Did anyone else hear that?" Brian forced a chuckle, though his smile had lost its confidence. "It's probably just a wild animal, nothing to worry about." But even he couldn't fully explain the strange sound. The noise echoed again, closer this time. The group began to feel that something was wrong. Sarah, the most anxious of them all, turned to Mark, who usually stayed calm in stressful situations. "Do you think it's what Jim was talking about?" Mark shook his head, but the confidence in his eyes had faded. "It's just the wind through the mountains," he replied, though deep inside, he couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. And then they saw it. As Anna's flashlight swept across the ground, it illuminated something horrifying. An enormous footprint, clear and terrifying. It was far too large for any known animal. The footprint was wide, deep, and each long toe was perfectly imprinted into the damp earth. An oppressive silence fell over the group. "You've got to be kidding," Brian blurted out, his eyes wide with shock. "What kind of creature leaves a print like that?" No one responded. They all stood frozen, the only sound being the wind and their heavy breathing. The footprint wasn't from any normal animal. It was too large, too deep, too deliberate, as if whatever left it had passed through only moments before. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the depths of the forest. The sound of trees crashing against each other was followed by a deep, guttural roar that reverberated through the earth. The group spun around, their flashlights illuminating nothing but fog and darkness. "What do we do now?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Mark raised his hand to signal for silence. He listened carefully, every nerve in his body on edge. The sounds from the forest intensified, the heavy thud of footsteps pounding the ground, as though something enormous was moving closer. "Run! We have to get out of here!" Mark shouted, grabbing Anna's hand and pulling her along with him. The group took off without another word, their breaths coming in gasps as they sprinted through the undergrowth, branches snapping underfoot. But the sound of the creature didn't stop. It pursued them, growing louder and closer, with each thundering footstep crushing everything in its path. Its roar echoed again, making the entire forest seem to shake under its immense power. "Faster!" Brian yelled, his legs nearly giving out from the sheer terror. He glanced back for a split second, and, through the dark haze, he saw what the others hadn't yet realized. A massive, towering figure with glowing red eyes burning through the night. The group finally reached the edge of the forest, where their car was parked. They scrambled inside, slamming the doors shut and locking them. Heavy breathing filled the cramped space, but outside, the darkness remained silent, as though it was waiting. Suddenly, a heavy thud hit the side of the car and Sarah screamed. Everyone turned to look, and there it was, the creature. It stood towering over the car, its red eyes glaring down at them. Its thick, filthy gray fur was soaked under the faint light of the headlights. "Go, Mark! Drive!" Anna shouted in panic. Mark didn't need to be told twice. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the car lurched forward, but the creature wasn't going to let them go that easily. It chased after them, its heavy footsteps pounding the road like a nightmare come to life. They sped along the rough roads, none of them daring to look back. Finally, as they exited the forest, the sound of the creature's footsteps faded, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. The group breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the fear still lingered in their eyes. They returned without saying a word. What they had witnessed couldn't be explained by logic or science. That creature, Bigfoot, was real, and it wasn't just some baseless legend as they had once thought. They had encountered something that none of them ever wanted to face again. From that night on, each of them carried their own personal fear. Though they had escaped the forest of Mount Rainier, they knew deep down that the creature was still there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to step into its territory. And perhaps it was still watching. The evening sun gradually set behind the Appalachian Mountains in Pennsylvania, bathing the forest in a brilliant orange hue. Kelly, Lucy, and Emma, three sisters who lived nearby, were eagerly preparing for their long-planned hiking trip. Kelly, the eldest and most experienced, always led their adventures. Lucy, the middle sister, was often hesitant but never backed down. And Emma, the youngest, carried with her an uncontainable excitement and curiosity. That day, they decided to challenge themselves by exploring a part of the forest that few dared to enter. The locals called it the Silent Zone, not because it was peacefully quiet, but because an eerie silence blanketed the area, and even the usual sounds of nature disappeared once inside. "Don't worry," Kelly smiled confidently when she saw Lucy and Emma looking a bit nervous. "We're just going to explore a little and head back before it gets dark." They started their hike with determined steps. The dense Pennsylvania forest, with towering trees and narrow, winding trails, stretched out beneath their feet. Birds chirped softly and leaves rustled underfoot, creating a peaceful yet mysterious atmosphere. Time passed quickly as they ventured deeper into the woods. The sun gradually dipped behind the mountains, and darkness began to envelop the landscape. The sisters started to feel the strange silence of the Silent Zone that the locals had warned about. Suddenly, Lucy stopped, clutching Kelly's arm tightly. "Kelly, something feels off." Kelly frowned, her eyes growing more alert. She paused and listened. Lucy was right. There were no natural sounds anymore. No birds, no falling leaves, just a dead silence. It wasn't the kind of peaceful quiet one might expect. It felt as if the entire forest was holding its breath, like something was lurking, waiting in the darkness. "We should turn back," Emma whispered, her voice shaky with worry. But Kelly, always the brave one, tried to stay calm. "We haven't gone that far yet. There's nothing to worry about. It's probably just how quiet the forest is." They continued walking, but each step felt heavier. The silence grew more oppressive, and then, from far away came a sound, neither wind nor the noise of wild animals. It was the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing through the woods. The three sisters froze. Their eyes were glued to the pitch-black space in front of them. The sound didn't belong to any creature they knew. It was slow and heavy, as though something enormous was moving through the thick underbrush. "Did you hear that?" Emma whispered, her trembling hands gripping Kelly. Kelly didn't respond. Her mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation for the strange sound. But before she could react, Lucy screamed in terror. "Look!" Kelly's flashlight beam shot forward, and in that instant, they saw it. A massive creature, nearly 3 meters tall, covered in gray fur. Its glowing red eyes reflected the light, staring back at them from the distance. It stood motionless, but its very presence was enough to flood the air with fear. "Run!" Kelly shouted, pulling Lucy and Emma along as they sprinted back toward the path they had come from. Their footsteps pounded against the ground, but the more terrifying sound was the heavy, thundering footsteps of the creature chasing them. The trees around them seemed to close in, forming dark, threatening shadows. Each step of the creature shook the ground, and its deep growl echoed through the forest. Their breaths became labored, their legs weakening from exhaustion, but they couldn't stop. Kelly didn't dare look back, but she knew the creature was gaining on them, getting closer with every second. "Keep going, we're almost out," Kelly shouted, though she wasn't entirely sure if that was true. Emma tripped and fell, but Lucy quickly helped her up. They knew that if they stopped for even a moment, the creature would catch them, and they wouldn't survive. Then, just when they thought they couldn't run any farther, the faint light of the setting sun appeared in the distance. They were close to the edge of the forest, where the creature wouldn't follow. But before they could celebrate, a deafening roar erupted from behind them, so close it felt as if the creature was about to grab them at any second. With every ounce of strength left, Kelly burst out of the woods, pulling her sisters with her. They collapsed onto the trail outside, gasping for breath, their bodies drenched in sweat. The creature stood at the forest's edge, its red eyes glaring at them menacingly. It didn't step out, as if the boundary of the forest was something it couldn't cross. In that moment, Kelly realized they were safe. But at the same time, she knew the creature was still there, lurking in the darkness of the forest, waiting for anyone foolish enough to enter its territory again. After that terrifying night, none of the sisters dared to speak of the experience they had endured. What they had seen couldn't be explained by logic or science. The giant creature with its glowing red eyes wasn't something anyone would want to believe in. Kelly, Lucy, and Emma never returned to that forest. Whenever they looked toward the Appalachian Mountains, the fear would rise again, reminding them of what lurked in the shadows of the wilderness. Perhaps the creature was still waiting, silent, making no sound, until others dared to test their luck once more. Pennsylvania was not just a place of peace and quiet. It hid mysteries that no one would want to uncover. I moved into this house about 6 months ago, nestled right at the edge of Pennsylvania's dense forest. It was a quiet and peaceful place, so serene at times that I felt like I had stepped into another world. My 2 large dogs, Buck and Rex, quickly adapted to their new home, often bounding around the yard, barking excitedly at passing squirrels or rabbits. But then something changed. Strange signs began to appear as darkness fell, and the tranquility of the forest slowly transformed into a terrifying nightmare. It all began one evening in late October, when I noticed that Buck and Rex started behaving strangely every time night descended. Normally, they would rush outside the moment I opened the door, running around as if to chase away anything that dared enter their territory. But lately, both of them huddled indoors, refusing to go outside even for a moment. My brave and proud dogs were now trembling whenever I merely cracked open the door, their ears perked, eyes fixed on the forest, as if something was lurking. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they sensed something I couldn't, perhaps a fox or some other wild animal. But as days passed, their fear grew more intense and unnerving. It wasn't just worry anymore. They growled erratically, staring into the darkened woods. Their eyes were not just glancing toward the forest. They were tracking something I couldn't see. And then came that night. The sky was darker than usual. Thick black clouds covered the heavens, leaving a suffocating darkness over the land. The forest was deathly quiet. No animal sounds, no familiar chirping of crickets. It was the kind of silence that should have caught my attention earlier, but I was too busy with work, thinking it was just another calm night. It was around 11 p.m. when I decided to call Buck and Rex back inside. Normally, we'd leave them out in the yard for a bit before bed. But that night, neither of them would step outside when I opened the door. I tried coaxing them out, but they remained frozen, staring anxiously toward the dark woods. "Come on, boys. Just for a few minutes," I said. But neither Buck nor Rex moved. Sighing, I decided to step outside on my own. "I can't believe this," I muttered to myself. But as soon as I stepped out, I was immediately struck by the sheer silence. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, and certainly no sound of the small critters that usually scurried across the yard. Suddenly, Buck started growling deeply in his throat, and Rex stood stiff, his eyes locked on the forest. I turned to look where they were staring, a chill running down my spine. The darkness ahead wasn't just any ordinary night. It was thick, oppressive, like a dense fog hiding everything. And from that thick darkness, I heard it. A footstep. It wasn't the light sound of an animal I might have heard before. These were heavy, deliberate steps pressing against the earth, slow but powerful. And then there was the breathing, deep and heavy, like a massive creature moving through the darkness, not in a hurry, but with certainty. I stood frozen, trying to make sense of the noise. But before I could react, Buck and Rex started panicking. They pulled hard toward me, their legs trembling as they tried to back away, growling but too frightened to move forward. I shone my flashlight into the woods, its weak beam cutting through the thick night air, but all I could see was the heavy, oppressive darkness. Still, I knew something was there, just beyond the trees, watching us. And then, I saw it. The beam of my flashlight briefly caught a massive shape standing between the trees. The creature was at least 3 meters tall, covered in thick gray fur. It stood still, but its glowing red eyes pierced through the night. A shiver ran down my spine. I knew instantly that this was no ordinary animal. It was Bigfoot, the legendary creature I had only heard about in stories. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My heart pounded in my chest, and my body froze in place. Bigfoot's eyes locked onto mine, full of threat. It didn't move, didn't attack, but just the sight of it sent fear coursing through my veins. Buck and Rex began whimpering, all the bravery they once had now gone. I backed away slowly, trying to pull my dogs inside, but each step felt like I was wading through a nightmare. With every step I took, the creature seemed to inch closer, its heavy breathing serving as a warning that it was watching my every move. Finally, with one last tug, I managed to drag Buck and Rex into the house and slammed the door shut. My heart raced, and I could hardly catch my breath. I peeked through the crack in the door, and there it was, Bigfoot, still standing at the edge of the forest, staring directly at me. It didn't move, almost as if it knew I was watching it. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared back into the darkness. The next day, I tried to rationalize what I had seen, but everything seemed beyond reason. I found no footprints or evidence, but I knew what I had witnessed wasn't a hallucination. From that night forward, the fear stayed with me. Buck and Rex never went outside at night again, and I never felt the same peace living near that forest. Whenever night falls, I remember those glowing red eyes and the deep, heavy breathing from the woods. The creature may have left, but the haunting memory of it lingers in my mind forever. After that terrifying night, I couldn't erase the image of the massive creature with its glowing red eyes standing silently at the edge of the forest. Each time darkness falls, the night becomes an invisible enemy, and every small sound sends chills through my spine. Buck and Rex, once so fearless, now curl up in the corner, refusing to go outside or bark as they used to. Both they and I knew the truth. Something was lurking in the dark. I tried convincing myself that everything would go back to normal. Maybe Bigfoot had left the area, perhaps it had just passed through, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The heavy footsteps, the deep breathing, still echoed in my mind, and the fear that the creature would return weighed heavily on me. That night, there was no moon, only the dense darkness enveloping the house. I carefully locked every door, ensuring no crack was left open. Buck and Rex, as usual, huddled in the living room, their unease clear in their eyes, as though they knew something terrible was about to happen. The world outside was eerily silent. No wind, no insects, Everything had gone still. I stepped outside with my flashlight to check around. The beam of light was weak against the overwhelming darkness of the yard. And then I heard it again. The heavy footsteps, this time much closer, just meters away. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble lightly, as if something enormous was approaching. I froze in place, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might leap out of my chest. I stared into the darkness ahead, and then, from the shadows, the creature appeared. Bigfoot, larger than before, its body shrouded in the blackness of the night. Its glowing red eyes blazed like torches in the dark. But this time, it wasn't just watching. It was moving toward me, step by deliberate step, its eyes never leaving mine. "Buck, Rex!" I shouted in panic. Both dogs sprang from the house at my call, standing protectively in front of me. They growled fiercely, trying to defend me. But I knew this wasn't an ordinary animal they were facing. The creature was too large, too powerful, and I had no idea if Buck and Rex could stop it. Buck, with all his strength, charged straight at the creature. Rex followed closely behind. They leapt at its legs, attacking with all the courage and ferocity they had. They bit and clawed, trying to stop the giant beast. But Bigfoot didn't flinch. With a single powerful swing, it sent Buck crashing into a nearby tree. The sound of bones breaking was unmistakable in the dead silence, and Buck lay still. "No," I screamed, running toward Buck. But before I could reach him, Bigfoot had already grabbed Rex. It lifted him as if he were nothing more than a toy, then flung him into a pile of rocks. Rex's body hit hard, and in an instant, both of my brave dogs lay motionless on the ground. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. In just a few moments, the two loyal companions I considered family had been ruthlessly taken from me. Pain and panic surged through me. I wanted to rush to save them, but I knew facing Bigfoot head-on would be certain death. The creature still stood there, its glowing red eyes locked on me, as if warning me that I would be next. It let out a terrifying roar, the sound shaking the ground beneath me. There was nothing I could do but turn and run back toward the house. I slammed the door shut and locked it tightly, my heart racing. But I knew there was nothing that could stop Bigfoot if it decided to break in. I grabbed a small gun from the drawer, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But deep down, I knew this tiny weapon was no match for such a powerful creature. I stood there in the darkness, my breath heavy and fast. And then, outside, I heard the heavy footsteps again, the deep breathing growing louder. It was right outside, just meters away. But instead of attacking, the creature stood silently at the door, as if it was sizing me up, waiting for something. After a long, agonizing moment, the footsteps faded. I cautiously peeked through the small window. The massive figure of Bigfoot was retreating into the thick trees, vanishing into the darkness of the forest. I couldn't sleep after that night. Buck and Rex were gone, killed mercilessly by the creature. I sat there in my grief, overwhelmed by fear and loss. But above all, I couldn't shake the terror. Bigfoot wasn't just a legend. It was real, and it had been watching me, every step, every moment. The next morning, I stepped into the yard where Buck and Rex had fallen. Tears filled my eyes as I remembered their sacrifice and the last haunting gaze of the enormous creature before it disappeared. I buried my two dogs in the garden behind the house, my heart heavy with sorrow. I had lost my most loyal companions, and I knew that from now on, I would never feel safe again. That creature was still out there, lurking in the darkness of the forest, and I knew it would return, not for me, but for the nightmare that I could never escape. I never thought a family camping trip could turn into the worst nightmare of my life. It all started with a simple plan: to enjoy the peaceful serenity of nature with my family, far away from the bustling city. We chose a campsite in Utah, right by the forested mountains, surrounded by the majestic beauty of nature. But what we experienced that night could never be explained by anything. When we arrived, the campsite seemed perfect. The sky was clear, the air fresh, and the dense trees created a quiet atmosphere. My brother Ben, my parents, and I set up our tents and prepared everything for the evening. We felt relaxed and energized for our week-long trip. Early in the evening, we met a park ranger. He looked tired, his eyes revealing a sense of caution, and when he approached us, his voice was filled with concern. "Good evening, folks. I just wanted to remind you that there's been a homeless man wandering around this area for a while. We've received reports of him roaming the forest, which might make some people feel uncomfortable. Please be cautious, but don't worry too much. We've tried finding him, but he always disappears into the woods." My dad smiled slightly, trying to lighten the mood. "We'll be careful. Thank you for letting us know." The ranger looked at us, his eyes more serious. "And if you hear anything strange in the woods, don't go out to check it." His final warning gave me a bit of a chill. There was something in his gaze, a worry I couldn't shake off. I never thought that a family camping trip could turn into the worst nightmare of my life. It all started with a simple plan: to enjoy the peacefulness of nature with my family, far away from the bustling city. We chose a campsite in Utah, right by the forested mountains, with the majestic beauty of nature all around us. But what we experienced that night can never be explained by anything rational. When we arrived, the campsite seemed perfect. The sky was clear, the air fresh, and the thick trees created a tranquil atmosphere. My brother Ben, my parents, and I set up the tent and prepared everything for the evening. We felt relaxed and full of energy for the week-long trip ahead. Early in the evening, we met a park ranger. He looked tired, his eyes showing signs of caution, and when he approached us, his voice was filled with worry. "Hello, I just wanted to remind you that there's been a homeless man wandering around this area for some time. We've received reports of him roaming the woods, which may make people feel uncomfortable. Just be cautious, but don't worry too much. We've been trying to locate him, but he always disappears into the forest." My dad chuckled lightly, trying to ease the tension. "We'll be careful. Thanks for the heads up." The ranger looked at us, his gaze more thoughtful. "And if you hear anything strange in the woods, don't go out to investigate." His final warning sent a chill down my spine. There was something in his eyes, a concern I couldn't shake. As night began to fall, our family sat around the campfire, chatting happily. The sound of insects and the crackling of the fire created a peaceful backdrop for the evening. But then, the atmosphere changed. The wind started to howl gently, and the usual sounds of the forest suddenly went silent. "Do you hear that?" Ben asked, his voice low as if afraid to break the silence. I frowned and listened. Nothing. No insects, no rustling of leaves in the wind, only an eerie silence enveloped the campsite. Then, from the darkness, a pine cone hit our tent. I jumped and turned, trying to figure out where it came from. "Is someone there?" My dad stood up, shining his flashlight into the forest. There was no response, but suddenly, more pine cones flew at us. They hit the tent, the fire, and even our legs. Ben shouted, "What the heck is this?" My dad stood up, flashlight in hand, scanning the area. "Who's out there? Show yourself." No one answered, but it was clear we were being pelted with pine cones from something or someone in the dark. My dad moved closer to the edge of the forest, his flashlight sweeping through the trees. I stood near the tent, trying to stay calm. But then, from the woods, came a sound. Heavy, deep footsteps, not the kind made by a normal person. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Ben. We looked at each other, fear beginning to take over. Then, deep, heavy breathing echoed from the darkness. My body froze, my heart racing. That sound didn't belong to a human. The night seemed to grow thicker, and my dad's flashlight barely pierced through the forest. But from the shadows, I felt something watching us, a massive creature, observing us intently. "Everyone, get in the tent," my dad yelled, his voice low and tense. "Now!" We quickly gathered everything and rushed into the tent, zipping it tightly shut. We all sat still, listening. Outside the tent, the heavy footsteps continued, each step deliberate and slow, as if a large creature was circling our campsite. "That's not the homeless man," my mom whispered, her eyes wide with panic. I shook my head, trying to stay calm, but it was clear that something terrifying was happening. None of us dared to speak. We just sat there, listening to the presence of something enormous outside. Then, suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Silence enveloped everything again. I exhaled, relieved, hoping the creature had left. But just as I thought it was over, a loud roar shattered the stillness. A deep, powerful sound, as if it came from the very earth itself. I gripped Ben's hand tightly, both of us trembling. My dad stood up, clutching a large knife, but we all knew it wouldn't do much good. That sound, unlike anything I had ever heard, seemed to send a deadly warning. The next morning, as the sun rose, we decided to pack up and leave the campsite as quickly as possible. But before we left, my dad and I decided to check the area around the tent. What we found left me speechless. Huge, deep footprints, clearly pressed into the damp ground. These prints were too large to belong to any human, larger than any footprint I had ever seen. They led from the edge of the forest to near our tent, then disappeared into the shadows of the trees. "We need to leave now," my dad said, his voice trembling. But before we could do anything, a loud scream echoed from the other side of the campsite, where another group had camped the night before. My dad and I rushed over, but when we arrived, the sight before us froze me in place. One of the campers lay lifeless on the ground, their body brutally torn apart. Blood was everywhere, and the others stood there, faces filled with terror and horror. "We have to leave," my dad said, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We drove away from the campsite in silence, my heart still pounding from what had just happened. No one in the family said a word, but the worried, tense look in my parents' eyes said it all. The brutal death of that camper was a warning we couldn't ignore. A dangerous, wild, and unseen creature still lurked in the Utah forest, and it may not stop. Our car sped away, but I couldn't stop myself from looking back at that dense forest. Something urged me to, as if an invisible thread tied me to that place, to a mystery I couldn't fully comprehend. When we reached the nearest town, we stopped at a motel to rest and calm down. My dad, with a stern look, started making phone calls to report the incident to the local police. He told them about the strange creature we had encountered, the huge footprints and the mysterious killing. But I could sense, even through the phone, the skepticism in the voice on the other end. Our story seemed too unbelievable for them to accept. After the call, my dad sat on the bed, his eyes cloudy. "We're never going back there," he said, his voice cold, "and I'll never let anyone in this family return to those woods." I agreed, but my mind couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I wondered if the creature we encountered was really Bigfoot, or was there something else, something even scarier, lurking in the deep Utah woods? That night, I couldn't sleep. The images of those massive footprints and the haunting deep breathing kept flooding my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about the camper's death, the torn-apart body and the terror on the faces of those who witnessed it. Around midnight, I decided to step outside for some fresh air. As I walked out of the motel, the cold Utah night air brushed against my skin. The sky was full of stars, but the silence was unsettling. I stood there, gazing towards the distant forest, and then I heard it again. Footsteps. No, not the heavy ones of the massive creature, but light, steady footsteps, as if someone was walking nearby. I turned, listening, but there was only silence. Yet the feeling of being watched surged within me, just like that night of terror, when we sat in the tent, being pelted with pine cones from the unseen darkness. I walked towards the edge of the parking lot, where the dim lights faintly illuminated part of the forest. In the distance, darkness engulfed everything, but I could still feel the presence of something. A presence I couldn't shake. "Is anyone there?" I whispered, hoping I was just imagining things. Suddenly, from the forest, a shadow moved. I couldn't make it out clearly, but the shadow was large, larger than any human or animal I'd ever seen. It stepped out of the darkness, moving closer. My heart pounded, cold sweat running down my spine. And then I saw it. Red eyes glowing like headlights in the dark. The same creature, the one that stalked us at the campsite. It hadn't disappeared. It had followed us, and now it stood right before me. I couldn't move. My entire body froze in absolute terror. The creature took another step, its red eyes glaring at me with hatred and power. It knew who I was, and I was certain it wasn't here to leave easily. Just when I thought I had no chance of escaping its deadly gaze, a gunshot rang out, piercing through the deadly silence. The creature recoiled, its glowing eyes flashing as if in pain. "Get inside!" my dad yelled from behind, holding his old but powerful hunting rifle. He rushed towards me, pulling me back into the motel as the massive creature stood still, roaring in anger, its voice echoing through the woods. We ran into the room, locking the door, my hands trembling uncontrollably. My dad stood there, his rifle still aimed at the door, his eyes sharp with caution. "How did it follow us here?" I gasped, my body shaking with fear. My dad didn't answer. He just stared at the door, as if waiting for something to happen. But I knew that the creature wouldn't give up easily. It had marked us, and now it was hunting us, step by step. The next morning, we left the motel, deciding not to stay another night. But as soon as we stepped outside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Massive footprints, deeply embedded in the damp ground. The creature had been standing there, right outside our room last night. "We need to leave and never come back," my dad said, his voice low with worry. We drove away from Utah, but deep down, I knew the encounter with that creature wasn't over. It was still out there, hiding in the shadows, and it might continue to follow us, no matter where we went. And one thing I knew for sure, we would never truly escape the ghost of those Utah woods.